A racist officer allows his K-9 dog to attack an elderly black veteran, unaware of the consequences that will follow just 10 minutes later. The streets were empty, the silence of the late evening broken only by the occasional hum of passing cars. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows over the cracked sidewalks, creating an eerie stillness that blanketed the neighborhood. Gerald Simmons, a 72-year-old retired veteran, walked home from the corner store, carrying a small bag of groceries that rustled softly with each step. His back was hunched with age, his hands calloused from decades of service and hard labor. The night was humid, the air thick, but Gerald moved at his steady pace, his mind lost in thought. He had seen worse nights than this, nights spent in foreign lands, under enemy fire, where each breath could have been his last. Yet here he was, decades later, still fighting battles of a different kind. Up ahead, the glow of police lights painted the street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The sight was a familiar one, but not a comforting one. Officer Darren Monroe, a man in his late 30s with a rigid jaw and cold eyes, sat in his cruiser, his K-9 unit, a German shepherd named Rex, resting in the back seat. Monroe had spent years patrolling this part of town, and he had his own ideas about who did and didn't belong. His eyes locked onto Gerald the moment he spotted him, suspicion flaring in his mind like an ember catching fire. Something about the old man's slow walk, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of time, sparked irritation in the officer. A man like that, out this late? Suspicious. It didn't matter that Gerald had lived in this neighborhood longer than Monroe had been on the force. It didn't matter that he had fought in wars so that men like Monroe could have the power they wielded now. To Monroe, Gerald was just another body in the wrong place at the wrong time. Without a second thought, Monroe gripped his radio and called in a vague report. Possible loiterer, needs checking out. It wasn't protocol, but it didn't have to be. In his mind, men like Gerald were always up to something. He could already hear the excuses forming, the feigned innocence. He had seen it too many times before, and tonight, he wasn't in the mood for it. Monroe stepped out of his cruiser, his boots striking the pavement with authority. The weight of his presence filled the air as he adjusted his belt, his hand hovering near his holster in a gesture meant to intimidate. He took a step closer. "Hey!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. "What are you doing out here?" Gerald turned, confusion flickering across his face. His joints ached as he shifted the grocery bag from one hand to the other. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. He had walked these streets countless times. Yet, the way Monroe stared at him, like he was an intruder, made him feel like a stranger in his own home. He kept his voice calm, respectful, the way he had learned to when facing men like this. "Just heading home, officer. Got my groceries right here." He lifted the bag slightly, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of experience. He had been through this before. Monroe didn't care. His eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the leather of his gloves creaking as he flexed his fingers. He inhaled sharply, as if expecting to catch a whiff of guilt. "You got ID on you?" Gerald frowned, his brow furrowing. He knew his rights. He knew he had done nothing wrong. "I don't see why I—" "ID. Now." Monroe's voice was sharper this time, his patience wearing thin. Gerald exhaled slowly, his breath coming out in a soft huff. He reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, not wanting to make any sudden movements. He had seen what happened when people moved too quickly. His fingers brushed against his wallet, but Monroe had already made up his mind. Something in Monroe's stance shifted. The old man's hesitation, his insistence on questioning authority, was enough to make his blood boil. This was his street, his rules, and he would make sure Gerald knew it. Monroe's hand twitched toward his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon, but close enough that the implication was clear. "Don't make this difficult," he warned, his voice a low growl. Gerald met his gaze, steady and unwavering. His bones ached, his body was tired, but his spirit had been through far worse. "I'm not making anything difficult, officer. Just trying to go home." The words sat heavy between them, thick with unspoken tension. The night pressed in around them, suffocating in its silence. Monroe's grip on his belt tightened, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He had wanted resistance, had wanted a reason to escalate. But the old man was giving him nothing. A slow smirk curled at the edge of Monroe's lips. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. Gerald watched him carefully, the warning signs flashing in his mind. He had survived wars, had seen men break under pressure, had learned how to read danger long before Monroe had ever worn a badge. And right now, everything in his gut told him that this was not going to end peacefully. Monroe took a step back, his eyes flicking toward his cruiser. A sick satisfaction flickered in them as he reached for the latch on his K-9 unit's door. The night was about to take a very dark turn. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken tension. Gerald sighed and reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, but Monroe had already made up his mind. His pulse quickened, a twisted anticipation crawling under his skin. He wasn't about to let some old man disrespect him. Not here, not tonight. The authority was his, and he would make sure Gerald understood that. In a single motion, Monroe unlatched the door to his K-9 unit. The click was deafening in the stillness, slicing through the thick air like a razor. The German shepherd's ears perked up, his body coiled, sensing the shift in his handler's demeanor. Monroe stepped back, his voice sharp, commanding. He barked out an order, the syllables cutting through the night like a whip. The dog responded instantly, a blur of muscle and teeth lunging forward with lethal precision. Gerald barely had time to react before the weight of the animal slammed into him, knocking him backward. His body crumpled onto the pavement, the hard concrete sending jolts of pain through his aging bones. Then came the teeth, sharp, unrelenting, tearing through fabric and flesh in a matter of seconds. A howl of agony burst from Gerald's throat as his arm twisted beneath the crushing force of the K-9's jaw. Blood seeped through the deep gashes, the crimson staining his shirt, his skin, the ground beneath him. His legs flailed instinctively, his hands reaching up in a desperate attempt to push the beast away, but the weight was unbearable, the force too strong. Monroe stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching with an unsettling calmness. His face was unreadable, cold. He showed no urgency, no concern. There was only indifference, as though he had seen this happen 100 times before, as though Gerald's pain was just another routine part of the night. Gerald twisted beneath the attack, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, memories flashing. His time in the war, the wounds he had endured, the way he had always pushed through. But this was different. This was his own country, his own streets, and the enemy was not some foreign soldier but the very people sworn to protect. Blood splattered onto the sidewalk as the K-9 dug deeper, growling, shaking its head viciously. Gerald's vision blurred, the world narrowing into nothing but pain and the deafening growls reverberating in his ears. Monroe tilted his head slightly, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low, a mocking edge to it. He muttered something under his breath, a cruel remark about compliance, about how this could have all been avoided if Gerald had just followed orders. The small crowd that had gathered at a distance remained frozen. Their faces were pale, their expressions a mix of horror and helplessness. Phones were raised, some recording, some calling for help. But no one moved closer. Fear anchored them to the spot. The sound of sirens was absent. Monroe had never called for backup. He had made sure of that. This was his show, his moment of control. Seconds stretched into eternity, each one an excruciating reminder of Gerald's fragility, his powerlessness in that moment. His limbs grew weaker, the searing pain in his arm now replaced by a dull numbness. His eyes fluttered, darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. Then, something changed. The violence, the sheer brutality of it began to outweigh Monroe's satisfaction. The blood pooling around the old man's body, the raw flesh beneath torn fabric. It was too much. The high of control, the power he had relished, suddenly soured in his gut. Monroe's breath hitched, his posture stiffening. His fingers twitched near his belt, his mind racing. This had gone further than he intended. He had wanted compliance, a lesson taught through intimidation. But this was something else entirely. He swallowed hard, a sudden weight pressing against his chest. The onlookers, their wide eyes locked onto him, were no longer silent spectators. They were witnesses. Monroe took a slow step forward, the weight of reality pressing down on him like a boulder. He barked another command, sharper this time, his voice cracking at the edges. The dog hesitated, its instincts still wired to obey, to inflict. Then at last, it relented, loosening its grip and stepping back, its tongue lolling, panting from exertion. Gerald barely moved. His body lay still, his arm a mangled ruin of torn flesh and exposed muscle. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling with excruciating effort. Monroe stared at the scene before him, the weight of his actions settling in his stomach like lead. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. What had he done? The crowd murmured now, voices rising, anger simmering beneath the surface. Someone had captured everything on their phone. Another dialed 911, their voice urgent, frantic. The distant wail of sirens finally broke the silence, drawing closer with each passing second. Monroe's heart pounded. The power, the control, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. And for the first time that night, fear crept into his bones. Monroe's breath hitched. He had gone too far. The realization crept up his spine like ice, a slow and suffocating grip of dread. He had lost control, not just of the situation, but of himself. The thrill of power that had surged through him only moments ago had now curdled into something rotten, something irreversible. He reached for his radio, his fingers hesitant, slick with sweat. His chest tightened as he realized the weight of what he had done. He had unleashed his dog without just cause. He had made a mistake. Gerald lay sprawled on the pavement, his body a wreck of torn flesh and mangled muscle, his breathing ragged and uneven. Blood soaked into the cracks of the sidewalk beneath him, seeping into the earth like an offering to some merciless deity. His limbs trembled, his body shuddering with shock, his skin pale and clammy under the dim streetlights. The pain was unbearable, radiating from the deep wounds that gaped open along his arm and shoulder. But it wasn't just the pain that struck Monroe, it was the look in Gerald's eyes. There was something there that cut deeper than the wounds, deeper than the shredded muscle and exposed tendons. His eyes, dark, worn, wise, held a disappointment so profound it sent a sharp pang of something unrecognizable through Monroe's gut. It was not just agony that lived in that gaze, but something far worse. The familiar, resigned weight of being let down. A lifetime of injustice, of betrayal, of battles fought and lost not in distant wars, but in the streets of the country he had once served. A lump formed in Monroe's throat. He wanted to look away, to turn, to bury himself in the armor of his authority, but he couldn't. He was frozen, trapped under the quiet condemnation in Gerald's stare. He forced himself to breathe, to move, to act. He barked a sharp command, his voice faltering at the edges, and Rex finally relented. The German shepherd loosened his grip, his muzzle dripping crimson, his breath coming in rapid, heated bursts. The dog sat back, panting, unaware of the gravity of what had just transpired. His ears twitched, his head tilting slightly as if waiting for the next command. But Monroe had nothing left to give. The world around him had changed in an instant. What had begun as another display of dominance, another moment of control, had spiraled into something beyond his grasp. The onlookers, who had remained still only minutes ago, were shifting, their hushed whispers swelling into something more substantial. He saw it in their faces, the disbelief, the horror, the growing rage. A woman held up her phone, her hands trembling, the device's small red recording light blinking like a beacon of damnation. Others followed suit, cameras raised, capturing his downfall frame by frame. He had wanted to send a message, to remind them who was in control. But now, it was his own actions being documented, his own moment of recklessness immortalized in digital permanence. His career, his authority, his reputation, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. A bead of sweat dripped from his temple. He clenched his fists, his fingers curling so tightly they ached. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to play out. The radio at his hip crackled to life, dispatch calling for an update. His hand hovered over it, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. He didn't know what to say. He had no words, no justifications. Gerald groaned, a broken sound that barely scraped past his lips. His body twitched, his fingers spasming weakly before going limp. The movement sent another wave of murmurs through the growing crowd. Monroe took a half-step forward, his instinct telling him to do something, to control, to command, to spin the situation back in his favor. But for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. For the first time in his life, Monroe felt fear. It wasn't the fear of retaliation, or even of losing his job. It was something deeper, something more insidious. It was the fear of knowing, with absolute certainty, that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The sirens were approaching now, distant but growing louder. His time was running out. He had always believed himself untouchable. He had worn his badge like armor, his authority like a weapon. But now, standing in the aftermath of his own violence, he realized the truth. He was not untouchable. He was not above consequence, and he was about to face it. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes too late to undo the damage. The paramedics moved quickly, their hands pressing against Gerald's wounds, desperate to slow the steady flow of blood. Their voices overlapped, a mixture of calm instructions and rising urgency as they assessed the damage. His body was broken, his breath shallow, his skin pale under the flashing red and blue lights. Blood soaked the stretcher as they lifted him, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through his limbs. Gerald barely had the strength to speak, but his eyes, sharp despite the agony, found Monroe one last time. He had faced war, had stood on battlefields where men fought for their lives and for their country, but this was a battlefield of a different kind, a war waged against him on his own streets, in his own city, by the very people sworn to protect. A tremor ran through his body as he exhaled, each breath taking more effort than the last. His voice, hoarse and nearly drowned beneath the sound of sirens, carried across the space between them. Gerald looked at Monroe with a gaze that held no hatred, no rage, just a deep, quiet disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Monroe stood motionless, the weight of those words pressing down on him like a vice. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. The words seeped into him like poison, twisting in his gut, coiling around his ribs like a slow, suffocating grip. The air grew heavier. The murmurs of the gathered crowd swelled, no longer a background hum, but a tangible force pressing in on him from all sides. By the time the internal affairs officers arrived, Monroe had no defense. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his badge would shield him from consequences. But there was no spinning this. The footage had already gone viral, spreading like wildfire across news stations and social media. His face, once a symbol of unchecked power, was now a mark of disgrace. News reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust toward him. Questions bombarded him, each one striking like a hammer against the fragile foundation of the authority he had taken for granted. The voices blurred together in a cacophony of accusations. He had once controlled narratives, dictated the outcome of encounters with a simple report, a carefully chosen statement. Now he had no words. There was no excuse that would erase what the world had seen. He was suspended on the spot. His radio was taken, his weapon removed. The badge that had once given him power now felt like an unbearable weight as he unpinned it from his chest. Investigations were launched. The police department scrambled to protect itself, issuing a carefully worded statement to distance itself from his actions. But it was too late. The city roared with anger. The protests outside the station grew by the hour, voices rising in unified fury, calling for his badge, his arrest, his punishment. Gerald, despite his injuries, became more than just a victim. He became the voice of a movement. His body bore the scars of the attack, but his mind remained sharp, unwavering. With each interview, each speech, he spoke not just for himself, but for those who had suffered in silence, for those who had been brutalized and ignored. His words carried across cities, through streets filled with people who had had enough. The footage of the attack replayed on every screen, each frame a damning indictment of Monroe's cruelty. The sight of the dog, its muzzle dripping with blood, of Gerald's frail body pinned beneath its weight, was an image that the public would not forget. And Monroe? His regret meant nothing. His name became a stain, a cautionary tale whispered in police academies, a grim reminder of what unchecked power could lead to. His world crumbled. His so-called brothers in blue turned their backs on him, eager to preserve their own reputations. His family refused to speak to him. The people he had once commanded now saw him for what he truly was, a man stripped of everything, left to drown in the consequences of his own making. His job was gone, his future erased. No department would take him now, no community would accept him. His home became a prison, a place where the walls felt like they were closing in. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder that the life he had built had been destroyed by his own hands. Once, he had walked these streets with confidence, with the arrogance of a man who had never faced consequence. Now, he walked with his head down, every passing stranger a reminder of his disgrace. The looks of disgust, the whispers, the way people turned away when they saw him. It was a punishment far worse than any courtroom sentence. He had made his choice. He had chosen cruelty, chosen to let power consume him. And now he would live with it, alone, unwanted and forgotten. A man who had once demanded respect now had none. A man who had once commanded fear now felt it in every waking moment. A man who had believed himself above the law was now crushed beneath the weight of it. And Gerald? He had survived, he had endured, and he had made sure that the world would never forget.